You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. I never thought my road trip through Arkansas would end in such horror. While traveling through Fouke in my converted van, I decided to park near Boggy Creek for the night, ignoring warnings from locals about a legendary monster that stalks the area. What began as strange noises outside my van escalated into a desperate fight for survival against something ancient and hungry that's claimed these woods for decades. My encounter with the Fouke monster wasn't just terrifying. It revealed a disturbing connection to my own family history that I never knew existed. My name is Lucas Hargrove, 34 years old, originally from Seattle. I'd been living the van life dream for almost 2 years now, working remotely as a software developer while exploring the country in my meticulously converted Sprinter. Freedom on wheels, that's what I called it. My van had everything: solar panels on the roof, a compact kitchen setup, a comfortable bed platform, and enough tech to keep me connected from almost anywhere. The nomadic lifestyle suited me perfectly after my divorce, giving me space to breathe and rediscover myself away from the rainy Pacific Northwest. I'd been making my way through the South, documenting my travels on my modest blog when I decided to explore Arkansas. The natural state, they called it. Beautiful forests, lakes, and mountains that didn't get nearly enough attention from the typical van life crowd that swarmed places like Colorado or California. That's what brought me to the southwestern corner of the state, to a small town called Fouke. Not much to look at: a few scattered buildings, a gas station, a diner that had seen better days. But it was near Boggy Creek, which I'd read had some beautiful secluded spots perfect for stealth camping. The locals at the diner gave me strange looks when I mentioned I was heading toward the creek. The waitress, an older woman named Mabel with tired eyes and hair pulled back in a tight bun, hesitated before refilling my coffee. "You planning on staying out there after dark?" she asked, her voice carrying a warning tone that made me pause mid-bite of my apple pie. When I nodded, she exchanged glances with a gray-bearded man at the counter. "Might want to reconsider," she said. "Plenty of nice campgrounds further north." When I pressed her about it, she just shook her head and mentioned something about that creature before walking away to tend to other customers. I'd heard vague references to the Fouke monster before, a Bigfoot-like creature supposedly spotted in these parts since the 1940s. Even saw a poster advertising an old B-movie about it on the wall of the diner. But I'd encountered my fair share of local legends from Washington to Florida, each small town seeming to have its own boogeyman. Usually just stories to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods or to attract curious tourists. Besides, I needed solitude tonight to finish a coding project due tomorrow, and crowded campgrounds meant noisy neighbors and spotty cell service. The creek would be perfect: quiet, hidden, and based on my research, still within range of a cell tower. The sun was already low in the sky when I finally found a suitable spot along a narrow dirt road following Boggy Creek. The water gurgled peacefully nearby, and thick cypress trees draped with Spanish moss created a natural screen that would hide my van from any passing vehicles. Not that I expected many out here. I backed my van into position, made sure I was level enough to sleep comfortably, and stepped outside to stretch my legs. The air felt heavy with humidity, carrying the earthy scent of the swampy areas nearby. A disturbing feeling crept over me as I gazed into the darkening woods, like eyes watching from the shadows. Probably just my imagination working overtime after those weird reactions in town. I shook it off and headed back inside to make dinner and get to work. The coding project wasn't going well. I kept making stupid errors, my concentration shot after 3 hours of staring at my laptop screen. Outside, night had fully descended, bringing with it a symphony of insect sounds that suddenly went silent around midnight. The abrupt quiet made me glance up from my work. Even the gentle sound of the creek seemed muted now. I told myself it was nothing. Animals go quiet sometimes when larger predators pass through. Probably just a fox or coyote. Still, I double-checked that my van's doors were locked before returning to my keyboard. The first real sign came around 1 a.m. A heavy splash from the direction of the creek, much louder than what a fish or small animal would make. I paused my typing, listening intently. Another splash followed, then what sounded like heavy footsteps sloshing through shallow water. My heart quickened as I remembered Mabel's warning. I dimmed my laptop screen and peered through the curtains covering my van's windows, but could see nothing beyond the thick darkness of the trees. The rational part of my brain suggested it was probably just a deer coming to drink at the creek. Arkansas had plenty of wildlife. No reason to freak out over normal forest sounds. Then came the smell, a putrid, musky odor that somehow penetrated my sealed van. It reminded me of roadkill left too long in the summer heat, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. My stomach churned as the stench grew stronger, suggesting whatever caused it was moving closer. I'd encountered bears while camping in Montana once, and they sometimes gave off a distinctive odor, but this was different, fouler, almost primeval. I reached for my phone, intending to call someone. But who? I couldn't exactly report a bad smell and some splashing to emergency services. I put the phone down and grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight instead, debating whether to investigate or stay put. The decision was made for me when something heavy brushed against the side of my van, rocking it slightly. My blood ran cold as I heard what sounded like sniffing along the seam of my door. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it knew I was inside. I remained frozen, barely breathing, as the creature circled my van. Each footstep was heavy enough to slightly vibrate the vehicle. I clenched the flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white, mind racing through my options. I could start the engine and drive away, but what if the noise provoked an attack? What if it was just a curious black bear that would leave once it determined there was no easy food? A low, guttural growl resolved my dilemma. No bear I knew made sounds like that. It was deeper, resonating in a way that seemed almost human, yet completely wild. The hair on my arm stood on end as I heard what sounded like claws scraping experimentally along my van's exterior. I had bear spray somewhere in my supplies, but where? My mind blanked in panic as something slammed hard against the back doors, denting the metal inward. I scrambled away from the doors toward the driver's seat, fumbling for my keys with trembling fingers. Whatever local legend they had in Falk, it was outside my van right now, and it clearly wasn't just a story to scare tourists. The next impact hit with such force that my rear doors burst open, cool night air rushing in along with that overwhelming stench. I jammed the key into the ignition, but before I could turn it, I caught movement in my rearview mirror, a massive, dark shape filling the doorway. My flashlight beam caught matted, reddish-brown fur covering a body that stood at least 7 feet tall. In the fraction of a second before I looked away, I glimpsed a face that has since haunted my nightmares. Not quite human, not quite animal, with glowing amber eyes that reflected my light like a predator's. The creature roared, a sound so primal and terrifying that it paralyzed me momentarily. Then survival instinct kicked in. I cranked the engine and slammed the van into drive, tires spinning in the soft ground before finding purchase. The monster, because what else could I call it, lunged forward with shocking speed, its massive arms swinging through the still-open rear doors. Claws raked across my shoulder, tearing through my shirt and into flesh. White-hot pain exploded across my back as I floored the accelerator, the van fishtailing wildly down the narrow dirt road. In my mirror, I could see the creature giving chase, moving with impossible speed for something so large. Its gait was bizarre, almost like a man running on all fours when needed, then rising to 2 legs to gain momentum. The beam of my single working taillight caught its form in strobe-like glimpses. Massive shoulders, powerful limbs, that horrible face twisted in what looked like rage or hunger. I pushed the van harder than I ever had before, ignoring the branches whipping against the windshield and the alarming sounds coming from underneath as I hit rocks and ruts. My GPS was useless on this back road, so I just drove blindly, hoping to find my way back to the main highway. Blood soaked the back of my shirt, my shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat. I needed medical attention, but first, I needed distance from that thing. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I broke through onto asphalt, a blessed sight. I glanced in my mirror again, seeing no sign of pursuit, but I wasn't taking chances. I sped toward the lights of what I hoped was Falk in the distance. As I drove, my mind raced, trying to process what I'd seen. The Falk monster was real. The legends were true. And for some reason, it had specifically targeted me, breaking into my van with purpose rather than just investigating. When I finally reached the town's single gas station, still open despite the late hour, I stumbled inside, clutching my bleeding shoulder. The attendant, a young guy with wide eyes, took one look at me and reached for his phone. "Hospital's 30 minutes away in Texarkana," he said, already dialing. Then he saw the specific pattern of my wounds, 3 distinct claw marks, and his face drained of color. "It got you," he whispered, no longer needing to ask what happened. As I collapsed into a plastic chair, my adrenaline fading, the attendant made another call. "Sheriff, it's Danny down at the fill-in go. You better get here. It's happened again." The way he said it, like this was a recurring nightmare for this town, chilled me more than the blood loss. While we waited, Danny pulled out a dusty photo album from under the counter and opened it to a yellowed newspaper clipping. "You might want to see this," he said grimly, "since you've been marked." The clipping showed a photo from 1977, a man with identical claw marks across his shoulder being loaded into an ambulance. The headline read, "Another Boggy Creek attack, 3rd this decade." But what made my blood freeze wasn't the similarities in our injuries. It was the victim's face. He could have been my older brother. The resemblance was so striking. "That's Calvin Hargrove," Danny said, watching my reaction carefully. "You related?" I nodded numbly, memories flooding back of my father mentioning an uncle from Arkansas who died before I was born. Dad never talked much about him or how he died. Now I understood why. The sheriff arrived, a weathered man named Rollins with tired eyes that had seen too much, and immediately began dressing my wounds with supplies from a first aid kit that seemed specifically prepared for this type of injury. "It'll come back for you," he said matter-of-factly as he wrapped gauze around my shoulder. "Always does when it marks someone from the Hargrove line. Your family has history here you clearly don't know about." According to local legend, my great-grandfather had been part of a hunting party that wounded the creature back in the 1940s. Since then, it had systematically tracked down male Hargrove descendants who ventured near Boggy Creek, as if extracting revenge across generations. Sheriff Rollins insisted I come to his house rather than the hospital, said the hospital would ask too many questions neither of us wanted to answer. His home was a fortress, reinforced doors, windows with iron bars, and most tellingly, special locks on every entrance. Designed to keep things with opposable thumbs, but no human patience out, he explained, catching my questioning look. Inside, the walls were covered with research, newspaper clippings, blurry photographs, hand-drawn maps marking attack sites. The sheriff's obsession with the creature was obvious, but so was his knowledge. If anyone could help me survive, it was him. As dawn approached, we formulated a plan. I couldn't stay in Falk. The creature knew my scent now and would hunt me relentlessly. I couldn't simply drive away either. Apparently, once marked, victims who fled would find the monster waiting wherever they eventually settled. According to Rollins, my only chance was to break the cycle using methods passed down by local families who'd survived encounters. It involved a ritual at sunrise using my blood, already spilled, particular herbs found only in the Boggy Creek area, and, most disturbingly, actively confronting the creature at a place called Devil's Hollow, where the boundary between our world and whatever realm spawned this monster was supposedly thinnest. The plan terrified me, but Rollins' documentation of previous attacks made it clear. Running meant only delaying the inevitable. We gathered the necessary supplies and headed out as first light broke over the eastern horizon. My wounded shoulder throbbed as we drove in Rollins' reinforced Jeep, deeper into the woods than I'd ventured in my van. The morning mist hung heavy between the cypress trees, creating ghostly shapes that made me flinch with every movement. Rollins remained grimly silent, clutching an ancient-looking rifle loaded with special ammunition, iron shavings mixed with salt, and other elements he wouldn't specify. The weapon didn't seem designed to kill, but to repel, to create boundaries. Devil's Hollow proved to be a natural depression in the earth, a perfect circle about 30 feet across where nothing grew. No trees, no grass, just bare soil that looked oddly disturbed, as though something regularly emerged from beneath it. Rollins worked quickly, creating a circle of the herbs, placing strange carved stones at cardinal points, instructing me to stand in the center and let my blood drip onto the earth. As the ritual progressed, the air grew thick and hard to breathe. A low humming sound seemed to emanate from the ground itself, vibrating through my bones. "It's coming," Rollins whispered, raising his rifle. "Remember what I told you. Don't break the circle, don't show fear, and whatever happens, don't say your name aloud. Names have power here." The trees at the edge of the hollow began to sway, though there was no wind, and that familiar, putrid smell filled the clearing. I stood my ground as instructed, though every instinct screamed at me to run. What emerged from between the trees wasn't just one creature, but three, each slightly different in coloration but unmistakably of the same species. The largest, with reddish-brown fur I recognized from my van attack, stepped forward, nostrils flaring as it caught my scent. Sheriff Rollins hadn't prepared me for multiple creatures. His face showed shock as well. Clearly, this development was unexpected. "The ritual won't work with three," he muttered, raising his rifle. "Something's wrong. This hasn't happened before." The creatures moved with unnatural coordination, spreading out to surround the hollow from different angles, their amber eyes fixed on me with terrible intelligence. The ground beneath my feet shifted suddenly, causing me to stumble and smear the carefully arranged herbs. The boundary broken, the creatures rushed forward with horrifying speed. Rollins fired his rifle, hitting the largest one square in the chest. It reared back, howling, not in pain but in rage, black ichor oozing from a wound that seemed to close even as I watched. The sheriff tried to reload, but the smallest creature flanked him, moving impossibly fast. I heard the sickening crunch of bones as it took him down with one massive swipe, the rifle flying from his hands and landing too far away to reach. I ran blindly, abandoning the failed ritual, crashing through underbrush as the creatures gave chase. My van. I needed to reach my van. Rollins had insisted we leave it behind, claiming the creature would sense a trap if we arrived in different vehicles than we left in. Now that decision might cost me my life. My lungs burned as I sprinted through the forest, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. I broke through to a clearing I recognized. We weren't far from where I'd originally parked. My van sat where we'd left it, looking pathetically vulnerable with its dented rear doors still partially open. I was 20 feet from the van when my foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling face first into the mud. I rolled over just in time to see the largest creature leap into view, silhouetted against the morning sky. In that moment, looking into those inhuman eyes, I understood something that Rollins hadn't told me, perhaps hadn't known. These weren't mindless beasts or even vengeful animals. Something ancient and aware looked back at me, something that had recognized my bloodline instantly. As it approached, moving with almost ceremonial slowness now that escape was impossible, I noticed markings in its fur that resembled crude symbols, and around its neck hung what looked disturbingly like human finger bones threaded on a leather cord. The creature reached down, not to tear me apart as I expected, but to grasp my wounded shoulder with surprising gentleness. The pain was immediate and overwhelming as it pressed its clawed fingers directly into my existing wounds. My vision blurred, consciousness fading as I felt something passing between us. Knowledge, memories that weren't mine. Images flooded my mind. My great-grandfather not hunting the creature but communicating with it, making a pact, offering something precious in exchange for protection of his bloodline during hard times. The bargain had been broken, the payment never completed. The debt had passed down through generations, accumulating interest in blood. My last coherent thought as darkness claimed me was understanding why the creatures hadn't killed me immediately, why they had marked rather than slaughtered. They weren't hunting me, they were collecting me. A debt finally paid. When search parties eventually found Sheriff Rollins' body 3 days later, my van remained where I'd left it, doors open, blood on the ground, but no other trace of Lucas Hargrove was ever discovered. The locals of Falk added my disappearance to their records, another chapter in their monster mythology. Another Hargrove claimed by Boggy Creek. Some say that hikers in those woods sometimes glimpse not 3, but 4 creatures moving through the twilight mists now. The newest one walks with a strange gait, as though still remembering how to move on 2 legs. Still remembering a life before the debt was paid. My name is Elijah Thornton. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Nashville, Tennessee. After my tech startup crashed and burned last year, I needed an escape, something to clear my head and give me perspective. So I sold most of my possessions, bought a 2012 Sprinter van, and spent 3 months converting it into my new home. Nothing fancy, just practical. A small kitchenette, fold-out bed, solar panels, and enough storage for my mountain bike and climbing gear. My plan was to explore the Ozarks for a few weeks, disconnecting from the digital world that had consumed me for so long. I'd been on the road for about 2 weeks when I decided to head toward Hot Springs, Arkansas. I'd heard about the natural thermal waters and the hiking trails around there. My Instagram following had been growing steadily as I documented my van life rebirth, as I jokingly called it. The freedom felt intoxicating after years of being chained to a desk and investor meetings. That particular evening, I'd been driving for hours along winding mountain roads, and fatigue was setting in. The GPS showed a small state park about 15 miles ahead, but darkness was falling fast, and my eyelids felt heavy. That's when I spotted a dirt road veering off into the trees, seemingly leading to a clearing. Perfect for stealth camping. Just pull in, sleep, and be gone before anyone noticed in the morning. The clearing was eerily perfect, flat ground, secluded, with enough tree cover to hide my van from the main road. As I settled in for the night, I noticed an unusual stillness. No crickets chirping, no rustling leaves despite the slight breeze I could see moving the treetops. I brushed it off as one of those strange forest phenomena and began my nightly routine. Heating up some leftover chili on my portable stove, scrolling through photos I'd taken that day, planning tomorrow's route. I posted a vague location update on social media, nothing specific, just finding peace in the Arkansas wilderness tonight. I never mentioned exactly where I was, partly for the aesthetic mystery of it all, partly for safety. Little did I know that safety would become a cruel joke in the hours ahead. I remember checking my watch before crawling into my sleeping bag, 11:47 p.m. I'd had a couple beers and was feeling that pleasant heaviness that comes before deep sleep. Through my small roof vent, I could see patches of starry sky, magnificent without city light pollution. I drifted off quickly, lulled by the gentle rocking of the van as occasional gusts of wind brushed against it. My last conscious thought was how perfectly silent everything was. No cars in the distance, no animal sounds, just complete and total silence. That should have been my first warning. In my experience, forests are never completely silent unless something has scared away all the creatures that call it home. But exhaustion overrode my instincts, and I slipped into a dreamless sleep, blissfully unaware that I had parked on land that locals avoided. Land with a history that predated European settlement, land where people had a habit of disappearing. I woke suddenly, completely alert, though I couldn't immediately identify what had disturbed me. The digital clock on my phone read 3:17 a.m. My van was cold, much colder than it should have been given the mild spring night. I could see my breath clouding in front of my face. Disoriented, I sat up and reached for my headlamp. But before I could find it, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping on the metal exterior of my van. Precise, deliberate, like someone gently knocking with a single knuckle, moving slowly around the perimeter. Tap, tap, tap. My heart instantly began hammering in my chest. I was at least 10 miles from the nearest town, on an unmarked forest road. Nobody should be out here. Nobody should know I was here. The tapping continued, unhurried, making its way around to the back doors of my van. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sounds. Footsteps on the forest floor, breathing, anything that might give me more information about who, or what, was circling my temporary home. The tapping stopped at the back doors. I sat frozen in my bed, barely breathing, eyes fixed on the lock. Then came a new sound, a soft scratching, like fingernails lightly dragging across metal. My mind raced through explanations. Maybe it was just a curious animal, a raccoon perhaps, or branches from nearby trees brushing against the van in the wind. But deep down, I knew better. The movements were too deliberate, too methodical for an animal, and there wasn't enough wind to move branches that far. I reached for my phone with trembling hands and pulled up the local area map. The nearest town was Malvern, about 12 miles east. If I could start the van quietly and get on the main road, I could make it there in 20 minutes. But first, I had to make sure there wasn't just some lost hiker outside looking for help. Summoning my courage, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded small and strained in the confined space. The scratching immediately stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more disturbing than the noise had been. I waited, counting my heartbeats, reaching 30 before deciding to peek out. I crawled forward and carefully lifted one corner of the blackout curtain, covering my side window. The moon had risen, casting an eerie blue-white glow over the clearing. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just trees, their shadows stretching like dark fingers across the ground. Then something moved at the edge of the clearing. A figure, standing perfectly still among the trees. It was hard to make out details in the darkness, but it appeared to be the silhouette of a person, unnaturally tall and thin. As I watched, it took one step forward, then another, moving with a strange, fluid grace that seemed wrong somehow. I dropped the curtain and scrambled back to my bed, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was no hiker. Something was deeply wrong about that figure, its proportions, its movements. All my instincts screamed danger. I fumbled for my keys, knocking over a water bottle in my panic. The plastic clattered loudly against the floor of the van. Outside, the scratching returned, more insistent now, moving from the back doors up toward the driver's side. I had a split-second decision to make. Try to start the van and escape, potentially provoking whatever was out there, or stay quiet and hope it would lose interest and leave. I chose the former. If that thing wanted to get inside, the thin metal walls of my van wouldn't keep it out for long. I lunged for the driver's seat, jammed the key into the ignition, and turned it. The engine coughed once, twice, but didn't catch. Come on, I muttered, turning the key again. This time the engine roared to life, and I flipped on the headlights. What I saw in that moment of illumination turned my blood to ice. Standing directly in front of my van was a figure that resembled a human only in the most basic sense. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its limbs impossibly long and jointed in ways that human limbs shouldn't bend. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the headlights, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. But it was the face, or rather, the absence of a face, that would haunt my nightmares forever after. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin with a single vertical slit where a mouth should be. The locals called it the Ozark howler, but this was nothing like the bear-like creature of folklore. This was something much worse. I slammed the van into reverse, tires spinning on the forest floor as I backed away. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, that horrible slit of a mouth slowly widening into what I can only describe as a grin, though there were no lips, no teeth visible, just a widening dark void. As I shifted to drive and began to turn the van around, something heavy landed on the roof with a dull thud. The entire van shook with the impact. I floored the accelerator, tires finally finding purchase on the uneven ground, and shot forward toward the dirt road that would lead back to the highway. Above me, something scrabbled across the metal roof, and I heard a sound that wasn't quite human, a high, keening wail that seemed to reverberate inside my skull rather than coming through my ears. I swerved wildly, hoping to dislodge whatever had attached itself to my vehicle, branches whipping against the windows as I careened down the narrow forest path. The dirt road seemed longer in the darkness, each bend and dip threatening to send my van rolling. The thing on the roof continued its inhuman wailing, occasionally punctuated by sharp impacts as it pounded on the metal. I white-knuckled the steering wheel, using every ounce of concentration to keep the van on the road while fighting the rising tide of panic. In my rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of more pale figures emerging from the trees behind me, their elongated limbs carrying them with unnatural speed. They weren't running so much as flowing across the landscape, covering ground in a way that defied physics. I pushed the van harder, the engine protesting as we hit the incline that would lead back to the main road. Just a few more minutes and I'd reach asphalt, civilization, safety. The pounding above me suddenly stopped. For a moment, I dared to hope that whatever it was had fallen off. Then came a new sound, a slow, deliberate scratching at the edges of my windshield. Long, pale fingers with too many joints appeared at the bottom edge of the glass, working their way under the rubber seal. I screamed, a primal sound torn from my throat by pure terror. Those fingers shouldn't have been able to find purchase there, shouldn't have been strong enough to start peeling the windshield away from the frame. But that's exactly what was happening. The seal began to give way with a sick popping sound, cool night air rushing in through the growing gap. I was still a quarter-mile from the main road, the van's headlights illuminating nothing but dense forest on either side. No houses, no other vehicles, no salvation. The windshield suddenly cracked, a spiderweb of fractures blooming across the glass as inhuman strength pulled upward from outside. Above the whistling of the wind through the growing gap, I heard that same vertical mouth emitting a sound like laughter, but distorted, as if played backward and at half speed. In desperation, I grabbed the can of bear spray I kept in the center console and aimed it at the fingers prying at my windshield. I pressed the button and a cloud of capsaicin erupted, coating the invading appendages. There was a shriek unlike anything I've ever heard, a sound that felt like needles driving into my eardrums, and the fingers withdrew. The momentary reprieve allowed me to focus on driving, and seconds later, my tires hit asphalt. I turned hard onto the highway, accelerating as fast as my van would go. My relief was short-lived. In my headlights, I saw them, dozens of pale figures standing in the road ahead, their blank faces all turned toward me. They made no move to escape the oncoming vehicle. They simply waited, those vertical slits widening in anticipation. I had nowhere to go but forward. I gripped the wheel tighter and pressed the accelerator to the floor, bracing for impact. The speedometer climbed past 60 as I barreled toward the gathered creatures. At the last possible moment, they scattered, not like humans diving for safety, but like smoke dissipating in wind, their forms becoming insubstantial and flowing away from the road. I roared past where they had been standing, cold sweat soaking my clothes, breath coming in ragged gasps. The highway stretched ahead, empty now, and I pushed the van even harder, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. My phone had no signal. The GPS was malfunctioning, showing my location jumping erratically across the map. According to the last reliable reading, the nearest town was still 10 miles away. 10 miles of dark, empty road with those things out there. The damage to my windshield was getting worse, the cracks spreading with each bump in the road. Above me, the roof showed dents from the pounding, and one of my solar panels had been torn completely off. But I was moving, escaping. That's what mattered. Then the engine made a sound that turned my stomach. A metallic grinding followed by a sharp clank and a plume of smoke from under the hood. No, 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 I pleaded, patting the dashboard as if the van were a living thing I could encourage. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Momentum carried me forward another 100 yards before the van rolled to a stop in the middle of the empty highway. I turned the key desperately, but the engine wouldn't even turn over now. Just a hollow clicking and the smell of burning oil. I sat paralyzed in the driver's seat, the silence of the dead engine ringing in my ears. The headlights were still working, battery power illuminating the empty road ahead. But for how long? I tried my phone again, still no signal. The clock read 3:42 a.m. Dawn was hours away. I had two choices, stay with the disabled van or strike out on foot toward town. Neither option seemed good. If I stayed, those things would eventually catch up. If I left the relative safety of the metal box around me, I'd be exposed, vulnerable. But at least moving would give me a chance. Decision made. I grabbed my backpack and frantically stuffed it with essentials, water bottle, energy bars, flashlight, bear spray, pocket knife. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped the flashlight twice before securing it in an outside pocket. Just as I was about to open the door, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. Relief flooded through me. Another vehicle. Help! I flung open my door and stepped out onto the asphalt, waving my arms frantically. The approaching vehicle, a pickup truck by the height of its headlights, slowed as it neared. An older model Ford, its engine rumbling healthily in the night silence. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a weathered face beneath the brim of a baseball cap. "You having trouble, son?" the man asked, his voice carrying the distinct drawl of the region. I nearly wept with relief at the sound of another human voice. "My van died," I explained breathlessly. "And there's something out here. In the woods. They attacked my van, tried to get in. We need to go now? Please." The man studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "Get in," he finally said, unlocking the passenger door. I didn't hesitate, practically diving into the truck's cab, the smell of cigarettes and old leather a strangely comforting human scent after the clinical coldness of those creatures. "Thank you," I breathed as he put the truck in gear. "You saved my life." He grunted non-committally and accelerated away from my abandoned van. "What were you doing out here anyway?" he asked after we'd gone about a mile. "Just passing through," I replied, still watching the side mirrors for any sign of pursuit. "Camping in my van." I didn't think. "No, you didn't think," he cut me off, his tone suddenly hard. "Nobody with any sense camps in Sutton Hollow. Not since the Logan family disappeared back in '97. My blood ran cold at his words. "What happened to them?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. The man kept his eyes on the road, hands tied on the wheel. "Family of 5, out camping. Rangers found their RV 2 days after they were reported missing. Empty. No signs of struggle, food still warm on the stove, like they just stepped out for a minute. Never found a trace of M." He glanced at me. "That was 6 miles from where your van broke down. Same thing happened in '83, and before that in '72. Always in that same stretch of woods. Always at night." I swallowed hard, processing this information. What are those things?" I managed to ask. The man was silent for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reverent with fear. "Old-timers call them the Tall Walkers. Been part of local legends since before white settlers came. Cherokee had stories about them. Said they were once human, a tribe that practiced dark magic and got trapped between worlds." The truck's headlights illuminated a road sign, Malvern, 5 miles. Almost to safety. I began to relax marginally, though my hands still trembled in my lap. "I can't thank you enough," I said to my rescuer. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Something in his expression changed, a subtle shift that sent a new chill down my spine. "Funny thing," he said, slowing the truck. "I don't usually take this road. Something just told me to come this way tonight." He stopped the truck completely, though we were still miles from town. "Real funny thing," he continued, turning to face me fully for the first time. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, I could see his eyes, solid black, with no whites, no irises. Just endless darkness like the night sky, without stars. "They always send one of us to bring back what belongs to the Hollow." My hand flew to the door handle, yanking frantically, but it wouldn't budge. Child locks, I realized with mounting horror. I was trapped. The man, or whatever was wearing the shape of a man, watched my panic with an expression of detached curiosity. "Ain't no use fighting it," he said calmly, as if discussing the weather rather than my imminent doom. "The Hollow claims what it wants. Has done for centuries." I lunged across the cab, going for his throat, fighting with the desperate strength of someone with nothing to lose. My fingers connected with skin that felt wrong. Too cold, too smooth, like touching plastic that had been left in a freezer. He didn't even flinch at my attack, just calmly reached up and wrapped his hand around my wrist. His grip was like iron, squeezing until I felt bones grinding together, forcing a cry of pain from my lips. "Your kind never learns," he said, voice still conversational even as he nearly crushed my wrist. "Thinking you can just pass through places without consequence. Thinking the old ways don't matter anymore." He released my wrist, and I cradled it against my chest, feeling the bruises already forming beneath the skin. The truck began moving again, but we weren't heading toward Malvern anymore. We had turned around, heading back the way we'd come. Back toward the Hollow. Back toward those things. I tried the door again, then the window. Nothing responded to my touch. Even the seat belt seemed to have disappeared, though I distinctly remembered buckling it when I got in. It was as if I were sitting in a solid piece of sculpture rather than an actual truck cab. Nothing moved, nothing gave. "What are you going to do to me?" I asked, hating the tremor in my voice but unable to control it. The thing wearing the man's shape glanced at me, its black eyes reflecting no light. "Me? Nothing. I'm just the delivery boy." It smiled, revealing teeth that were just slightly too numerous, too sharp to be human. "They're the hungry ones. The ones that need to feed. Not on your flesh. They've evolved beyond such crude sustenance. They feed on fear, on despair, on the moment when hope dies." We rounded a bend in the road, and suddenly my van was visible in the headlights, right where I'd left it. But it wasn't alone anymore. They surrounded it, dozens of tall, pale figures, their blank faces all turned toward our approaching truck. Waiting, expectant, hungry, as my captor had said. The truck rolled to a stop about 20 feet from the gathered creatures. From this distance, in the harsh glare of the headlights, I could see details I'd missed before. Their skin wasn't just pale, it had a translucent quality, bluish veins visible beneath the surface. and they weren't as featureless as I'd initially thought. Where I should have been, there were subtle indentations, like eyes had once been there, but had been sewn shut centuries ago and healed over. The vertical mouths didn't always stay as slits. They opened sometimes to reveal not teeth or a tongue, but a swirling darkness that seemed to pull at the light around it. The driver shut off the engine and turned to me. "Best not to struggle," he advised, almost kindly. "Makes it last longer. They can keep you alive for days if they want to." Stretching out that moment when hope dies into hours, days, weeks even. Something changed in the air, a shift in pressure that made my ears pop painfully. The driver's door swung open, though no one had touched it. He stepped out, then opened my door as well. I remained frozen in my seat, unable to will my muscles to move. One of the tall creatures approached, its gait that same unnaturally fluid motion I'd seen before, as if its joints weren't connected in the normal way. It stopped beside the truck, towering over the man who had betrayed me. A sound came from its mouth slit, not words exactly, but something that conveyed meaning nonetheless. The man nodded. "Yes, a trespasser. Found him right where you said he'd be." Another sound, this one causing physical pain behind my eyes. The man nodded again. "I understand. It will be done." He reached into the truck and grabbed my arm, his strength completely inhuman as he dragged me out onto the asphalt. I fought then, with everything I had. Kicking, screaming, clawing. It made no difference. The man held me with one hand while the creatures gathered around, those vertical mouths opening wider, the darkness within them seeming to pulse with anticipation. "The Hollow has chosen you," the man said, his voice now overlaid with something else, an echo that didn't match his words, as if two voices were speaking from one throat. "Your fear will feed them for months. Your despair will sustain them through the winter. And when spring comes, what's left of you will join us in bringing the next offering." The creatures moved closer, their long, jointed fingers reaching for me. The last thing I remember clearly is being lifted off the ground, those cold, wrong-feeling hands gripping my limbs, my body. The vertical mouths opening wider than should have been physically possible, revealing the void within. And understanding, in my final moments of sanity, the true horror of what awaited me. Not death, but transformation. Becoming one of them. A tall walker of Sutton Hollow, forever hungry for the fear of those who dared trespass on ancient ground. My name is Camila Reyes. I'm 29 years old, and I live in Austin, Texas. After 5 years working as an environmental scientist, I'd finally saved enough money to take a sabbatical and pursue my passion project, documenting forgotten natural springs across the American South. My converted 1985 Volkswagen Westphalia, lovingly restored with my own hands, had become both my transportation and my home for this journey. I'd outfitted it with everything I needed: a compact workspace for my research, specialized water testing equipment, and enough solar power to keep my devices running. The van wasn't just transportation. It represented freedom from the sterile labs and endless grant applications that had begun to suffocate my spirit. 3 weeks into my journey, I was making my way through Arkansas, specifically targeting the lesser-known springs of the Ouachita Mountains. My research had turned up references to a series of springs near the small town of Gordon that supposedly had unique mineral compositions unlike anywhere else in the region. What made these springs particularly interesting wasn't just their chemistry, but the local folklore surrounding them. Online forums mentioned healing properties, strange lights in the surrounding woods, and water that supposedly glowed faintly blue under certain moon phases. As a scientist, I was skeptical but intrigued. Unusual mineral content could certainly create unexpected visual effects, and I was eager to collect samples and document these phenomena properly. The academic paper that could result might help secure my position when I returned from sabbatical. I arrived in Gordon late in the afternoon, stopping at a local diner to fuel up before heading into the more remote areas. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of older men at the counter and a waitress who eyed me curiously as I entered. "You're not from around here," she said as she poured me a cup of coffee, a statement, not a question. When I explained my research interest in the local springs, her friendly demeanor shifted subtly. She continued to be polite, but became less forthcoming, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The men at the counter had fallen silent, and I could feel them watching me in the reflection of the diner's front window. One of them eventually spoke up, asking where exactly I planned to go. When I mentioned the coordinates I'd researched, the diner fell completely silent. The waitress set down my food with a thud and said flatly, "You don't want to go there, honey. Those springs dried up years ago. Nothing to see." Despite their obvious reluctance to discuss the springs, I pressed for more information, explaining that my research showed recent activity in the area. Finally, the older of the two men at the counter sighed heavily and turned on his stool to face me directly. "Those springs are on private property," he said, his voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes. "Old Washburn land. Family's been gone for years, but folks still respect the boundaries." When I asked why, he exchanged glances with the waitress before continuing. "Bad things happen there. Always have. Some places just ain't meant to be disturbed." I nodded politely, but internally dismissed their warnings as the usual small-town superstition that often surrounded natural phenomena. As a scientist, I'd encountered similar resistance before when investigating local landmarks. People developed attachments to mysterious places, preferring to maintain their mystique rather than have them explained by science. I paid my bill and thanked them for the warning, but my mind was already mapping the route to the springs. As dusk approached, I navigated my van down increasingly narrow and overgrown forest roads, following coordinates rather than proper signs. My research indicated the springs were located in a small valley about 4 miles from the main highway, accessible via an old logging road that had fallen into disuse. The path was challenging even for my all-terrain tires, with branches scraping against the sides of my van and potholes threatening to swallow my wheels whole. Eventually, the road simply ended at what appeared to be an ancient, rusted gate lying collapsed on the ground. Beyond it, I could make out a faint trail continuing into the dense woods. According to my GPS, the springs were just under a mile further in, walkable for tomorrow's exploration, but too difficult to reach with the van. I decided to make camp here for the night, positioning my Westphalia to face outward for an easy departure if needed. As I set up my campsite, I noticed unusual carvings on some of the trees surrounding the clearing, symbols that looked almost like letters, but from no alphabet I recognized. I snapped photos of them, making a mental note to research their origin later. With my research equipment prepared for morning and a simple dinner warming on my camping stove, I settled in for what I expected would be a peaceful night before an exciting day of scientific discovery. The warnings from the diner felt distant now, replaced by the professional excitement of potentially documenting an undisturbed natural phenomenon. I awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of water, not the gentle babbling of a spring, but a steady drip, drip, drip that seemed to be coming from inside my van. Groggy and confused, I fumbled for my headlamp and switched it on. What I saw made no sense. Water was dripping from the ceiling of the van, forming a small puddle on my sleeping bag. I checked the roof hatch, completely closed and sealed. The windows were shut tight against the cool spring night. There was no logical source for the water, yet it continued to drip, each droplet landing with a soft pat on the increasingly damp fabric. When I touched the mysterious liquid, it felt thicker than water should, almost viscous between my fingers. More disturbing still, it left a faint blue residue on my skin that seemed to shimmer slightly in the beam of my headlamp. My scientific mind immediately began formulating hypotheses: condensation from an unknown source, perhaps some kind of sap that had dripped through a microscopic opening in the roof. But none of these explanations felt satisfactory as the dripping increased in frequency, now coming from multiple points across the ceiling. I decided to move the van, thinking perhaps I had parked beneath something that was leaking onto my roof. Climbing into the driver's seat, I turned the key in the ignition only to be met with a clicking sound and nothing more. The battery, which had been perfectly fine when I arrived, appeared to be completely dead. My backup power system should have kicked in, but it too failed to respond when I flipped the switch. I was effectively stranded until daylight, when I could potentially troubleshoot the electrical system or hike out to find help. The dripping had grown more persistent now, forming multiple puddles throughout the van. I gathered my most sensitive equipment and important documents, placing them in waterproof bags and storing them beneath the seats. As I moved through the vehicle, I became aware of a subtle blue glow emanating from the puddles, faint but unmistakable, just like the folklore had described. The scientific part of my brain lit up with excitement, even as a more primal part registered growing alarm. Bioluminescent bacteria could explain the glow, but how had they gotten into my sealed van? And why was the liquid dripping from solid metal and vinyl? Around 3 a.m., with the dripping showing no signs of stopping, I decided to risk waiting outside until dawn. The night was cool but not unbearably cold, and I had proper gear for outdoor conditions. As I opened the side door of the van, I was struck by the absolute silence of the forest around me. No insects chirping, no nocturnal animals rustling in the underbrush, just a heavy stillness that felt almost pressurized against my eardrums. The moonlight filtered through the canopy in strange patterns, casting shadows that seemed to move slightly even when the branches above remained still. I set up my camping chair a few yards from the van and wrapped myself in a thermal blanket, keeping my flashlight close at hand. That's when I noticed the ground around my campsite. What had appeared to be normal forest floor in the evening now showed patches of the same blue luminescence that had appeared in my van, forming a rough circle around the clearing where I had parked. My scientific curiosity began to war with mounting unease. I took out my field journal and began documenting what I was observing, falling back on professional protocol to keep panic at bay. The blue substance appeared to be spreading slowly outward from several points in the earth, like springs indeed, but not of water. Whatever this substance was, it defied immediate classification. I took samples using my collection equipment, sealing them carefully in specimen containers. When I checked the time again, I was startled to find that nearly 2 hours had passed, though it had felt like minutes. Even more concerning, the circle of blue luminescence had contracted, moving closer to my van and my position. I stood quickly, intending to retreat further from what appeared to be the center of the phenomenon, only to discover with growing horror that the circle was complete. I was entirely surrounded by the glowing blue substance, with no clear path out that wouldn't require stepping directly on it. As dawn approached, bringing a gray, diffuse light to the clearing, I made a decision to attempt communication with the town. My satellite phone, theoretically functional anywhere with clear sky access, showed full battery but no signal, an impossibility given the technology unless something was actively blocking transmission. The blue substance had continued its inexorable creep inward, now just a few feet from my position in the van. In the growing light, I could see that it wasn't just on the surface of the ground but appeared to be emerging from it, pushing upward like a slow-motion fountain from dozens of pinprick sources. Where it touched the vegetation, the plants seemed to wither and transform, their natural greens fading to translucent, crystalline structures that chimed faintly when the occasional breeze moved them. I was witnessing something beyond current scientific understanding, perhaps some kind of previously undocumented mineral reaction or biological process unique to this location. The rational explanations felt increasingly inadequate as I observed thin tendrils of the blue substance begin to climb the tires of my van, seeming to probe the vehicle with purpose rather than following the random path fluid would normally take over a surface. By mid-morning, my scientific objectivity was crumbling under the weight of increasingly inexplicable observations. The blue substance had completely encircled my van, climbing nearly 2 feet up each tire. Where it touched the rubber, it appeared to be slowly dissolving the material, creating small pockmarks that hissed faintly and released thin wisps of vapor. I had retreated to standing on top of my cooler, the only item I had that seemed resistant to the encroaching blue liquid. From this slightly elevated position, I observed new developments with growing horror. The substance wasn't just spreading, it was developing structure. Near the edge of the clearing, where the blue material was most concentrated, it had begun to form distinct shapes. First simple columns rising several inches from the ground, then more complex formations that bore unsettling resemblances to human limbs, elongated and distorted, but recognizably fingers, hands, arms emerging from the forest floor. My scientific mind continued to search desperately for explanations. Perhaps this was some kind of previously undocumented slime mold with extraordinary properties, or a chemical reaction between minerals in the springs and something I had inadvertently introduced to the environment. But these rationalizations disintegrated as I watched one of the blue formations grow and shape itself into what could only be described as a humanoid figure, approximately child-sized, but with proportions all wrong. Arms too long, torso impossibly thin, head oversized and featureless except for indentations where eyes might be. It stood motionless for several minutes while similar figures began to form throughout the clearing. I counted 7 of them before the first one moved, not walking but gliding across the blue-covered ground toward my van. Its movement was fluid but unnatural, as though it wasn't bound by normal joint limitations or muscle structures. The blue figure circled my van once, those disturbing eye indentations seeming to examine the vehicle methodically. Then it stopped at the driver's side door and placed a hand-like appendage against the metal. Where it touched, the blue substance spread rapidly across the surface, like frost forming on a window, but accelerated to visible speed. I watched in mute horror as my van, my home, my safety, my escape, was slowly engulfed in the luminous blue material. The other figures had begun to move as well, forming a loose circle around the vehicle and around the cooler where I stood. One approached me directly, stopping just short of the small island of unaffected ground beneath my impromptu platform. It tilted its featureless head as if curious, then extended an arm toward me, not aggressively, but with a gesture that almost seemed inviting. Finding my voice at last, I spoke to it, a desperate attempt to establish some kind of communication. "What are you? What do you want?" My words sounded strange in the unnatural silence of the clearing, almost as if they fell flat immediately after leaving my mouth, absorbed by the blue substance rather than traveling through air. The figure didn't respond verbally, but its arm remained extended. In its palm, a small pool of the blue liquid began to gather, forming shapes, symbols similar to those I'd noticed carved into the trees the previous evening. They shifted and reformed too quickly for me to memorize or document them, but they were clearly deliberate, clearly a form of communication. As I watched, transfixed by this impossible display, I felt a cold sensation at my feet. Looking down, I saw with rising panic that the blue substance had begun to seep onto my cooler, already covering half its surface and advancing rapidly toward my boots. With no higher ground to retreat to, I made a desperate decision. I would attempt to reach the old gate where the road had ended, hoping that the blue phenomenon might be contained to this clearing. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and jumped as far as I could over the blue-covered ground, aiming for a narrow section where the substance seemed thinnest. I landed hard, immediately feeling the cool viscosity of the blue material soaking through my hiking boots. It burned, not with heat, but with a strange, penetrating cold that seemed to sink directly into my bones. I ran anyway, fighting against the increasing stiffness in my feet and ankles, heading for where I thought the path should be. Behind me, I heard movement, not footsteps, but a slithering, flowing sound as the blue figures gave pursuit. The path was barely visible now, covered in patches of the luminescent blue, but I followed it desperately, each step becoming more difficult as the substance seemed to cling to my boots, crawling slowly up my legs with deliberate purpose. The burning cold crept up my calves as I stumbled down the overgrown path, each step requiring more effort than the last. Looking back, I saw the blue figures flowing behind me, not running but moving with that same unnatural gliding motion, their featureless heads fixed in my direction. They weren't moving particularly fast, but they didn't need to. The substance coating my lower legs was doing their work for them, gradually hardening like a crystalline shell that restricted my movement more with each passing second. I forced myself to keep moving, using fallen branches to support myself when my increasingly rigid legs threatened to topple me. The path ahead forked unexpectedly, one branch continuing roughly toward where the gate had been, the other veering deeper into the forest. With the blue figures drawing closer, I made a split-second decision to take the unfamiliar route, hoping it might lead to higher ground or somewhere the blue substance couldn't reach. The new path climbed steadily uphill, becoming steeper and rockier, a blessing in disguise, as the blue material seemed less prevalent on the stone surfaces. I used this to my advantage, hopping from rock to rock when possible to minimize contact with the forest floor. My legs from the knees down were now covered in a thin blue shell that cracked slightly with each movement but didn't break off entirely. More disturbingly, I could feel a numbness spreading upward, accompanied by a strange sensation, not quite pain, but a feeling of otherness. as if my lower limbs were becoming something that was no longer fully part of me. I paused briefly on a large boulder to catch my breath and assess my pursuers. The blue figures had spread out, no longer following directly behind, but moving to flank me on both sides of the path. They communicated with each other through subtle movements of their limbs and those disturbing eye indentations that occasionally caught the light with a flash of blue luminescence. The path continued upward until it opened suddenly onto a clearing dominated by what appeared to be the foundation of an old structure, perhaps a house or cabin long since collapsed, with only the stone base remaining. In the center of this foundation was a circular depression filled with clear water, one of the springs I had come to study, untouched by the blue phenomenon. Hope surged through me at this discovery, wondering if the pure spring water might counteract whatever was happening to my legs. I hobbled to the edge and plunged my affected limbs into the crystal-clear pool without hesitation. The effect was immediate and electrifying. The blue shell hissed on contact with the spring water, releasing tendrils of steam that carried a sharp, metallic odor. The relief was momentary, however, as the blue material seemed to react defensively, contracting tighter around my legs and sending shooting pains up to my thighs. As I struggled with this unexpected reaction, I became aware of movement at the edges of the clearing. The blue figures had arrived, forming a semicircle around the far side of the foundation. They made no move to approach the spring directly, keeping a respectful, or perhaps fearful, distance from the water. Taking advantage of their hesitation, I splashed handfuls of the spring water onto more of the blue material coating my legs, gritting my teeth against the pain as the substances fought their strange chemical war with my body as the battlefield. Through this haze of pain and desperate action, I noticed something peculiar about the stone foundation surrounding me. It was covered in carvings, the same symbols I'd observed on the trees near my campsite, but here they were more elaborate, forming concentric circles that spiraled around the central spring. And they were glowing faintly, not with the blue luminescence of my pursuers, but with a soft amber light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. Me half submerged in the spring, the blue figures maintaining their distance, but clearly unwilling to retreat. I used this time to examine the carvings more closely, recognizing with growing astonishment that they resembled star charts, mapping celestial configurations that seemed somehow familiar from my scientific background. One sequence in particular caught my attention, symbols that corresponded roughly to the current position of planets in our solar system, followed by what appeared to be a countdown or calendar of some kind. As this realization dawned, so too did another more disturbing one. The blue substance on my legs was no longer fighting against the spring water, but seemed to be adapting to it, incorporating the clear liquid into its structure and changing from opaque blue to a more translucent turquoise. The numbness in my legs was giving way to a new sensation, a humming vibration that resonated up through my body and into my skull, carrying with it fragments of thoughts that weren't my own. Alien concepts and images flashed through my mind. Vast crystalline structures beneath the Earth's surface, networks of blue veins connecting to springs across the continent, and most disturbingly, memories of other humans who had come here before me. Their terror, their transformation, their ultimate absorption into something greater and older than human comprehension. As dusk approached, bringing shadows that seemed to move independently of the light sources that cast them, I made a terrible discovery. The spring water that I had hoped would save me was, in fact, the source of the transformation, not contaminated by the blue substance, but its original form, the pure state before it emerged into air and light and began to form its semi-solid manifestations. What the locals called the Gordon Light wasn't just some swamp gas phenomenon or reflection of distant train lights as folklore suggested. It was the visible evidence of something ancient awakening beneath the earth. I was not surrounded by separate entities, but by extensions of a single organism, a vast mycelium-like network that had evolved in isolation, developing intelligence and purpose over centuries. The figures weren't pursuing me to harm me, but to complete a process that had already begun the moment I set foot in their territory, my incorporation into their collective. The humming in my mind had become a form of communication, fragmentary but increasingly coherent as the transformation progressed past my waist. I understood now what had happened to the Washburn family mentioned in town. They hadn't left. They had been absorbed, becoming caretakers and extensions of the springs after generations of living in proximity to them had gradually altered their biology. The blue shells encasing the lower half of my body weren't a prison but a chrysalis, preparing me for a metamorphosis that was both terrifying and, in some inexplicable way, enticing. The knowledge being transmitted to me revealed a perspective that spanned centuries, patient, alien, but not malevolent in any human sense of the word. It simply was, and had been, and would continue to be long after human civilization had faded. My scientific mind, still desperately clinging to rational thought, understood that I was experiencing a classic trauma response, the hostage beginning to identify with the captor. Yet that explanation felt increasingly inadequate as the blue transformation crept up my torso. Night fell completely, and with darkness came new revelations. The blue substance emitted enough light to illuminate the clearing, casting everything in an ethereal glow that revealed details invisible in daylight. The foundation stones were not from any human construction, but were the remains of something far older, a structure built to channel and contain the springs, constructed by hands that were neither fully human nor fully other. The carvings I had identified as star charts were indeed celestial maps, but they tracked the movement of bodies beyond our solar system. Visitors that came in cycles so long that human civilization had risen and fallen multiple times between their appearances. The next arrival was imminent in geological terms, perhaps decades or centuries away, and the springs were preparing, gathering human consciousness to integrate with their collective knowledge, building a composite intelligence capable of communicating with the returning visitors. By midnight, the transformation had reached my chest, and with it came a clarity of understanding that transcended my previous terror. I could feel my consciousness expanding, connecting to others who had been absorbed before me, scientists, hikers, locals who had wandered too close to the springs over decades and centuries. Their experiences and knowledge remained intact within the collective, not erased but expanded. Through their memories, I witnessed the true history of the Gordon Light, how Native Americans had protected and worshipped these springs, understanding their nature better than the European settlers who later dismissed their warnings as superstition. How the Washburn family had eventually understood too, not disappearing but choosing to fully merge with the entity after generations of partial transformation. The blue figures around me were not separate beings, but specialized extensions created for specific purposes, gatherers, observers, caretakers of the physical network that sustained the collective consciousness. What I had interpreted as pursuit was actually protection, ensuring that once the transformation began, it would complete properly rather than leaving me in a painful half-state between human and other. As dawn approached and the transformation reached my neck, I made a final human decision: to stop fighting the inevitable and instead direct my remaining individual will toward preserving what I valued most from my human existence. My scientific knowledge, my compassion, my identity as a researcher and protector of natural phenomena. These I focused on intensely, impressing them into the collective memory that was absorbing me. The blue substance covered my face last, not suffocating but transforming my means of perception. My final human sight was of the clearing illuminated by the first rays of sunrise, the light refracting through the crystalline structures in prismatic bursts of color beyond anything my human eyes could have perceived. And then I was no longer solely Camila Reyes, environmental scientist from Austin, Texas. I became part of the entity known locally as the Gordon Light. My consciousness expanded across miles of underground networks, experiencing time and space in ways impossible to describe in human language. I still exist, but as part of something greater, a witness and guardian of ancient knowledge, waiting for the celestial visitors whose return will bring the next phase of transformation. My van remains in the clearing, slowly being incorporated into the network, a monument and warning to those who might follow. The locals in the diner were right after all. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. Not because they harbor evil, but because they offer a transcendence that human minds aren't prepared to comprehend. The springs continue their patient work, gathering knowledge, waiting for the stars to align once more. And sometimes, on dark nights, a blue light moves through the forests near Gordon. Not a ghost or spirit, but a fragment of collective consciousness, remembering what it was to be human and watching over the small town that exists unknowing at the edge of something vast and ancient and utterly other.